So for this homework assignment, you are asked to do exercise 8.2b on page 231 to 232. You are asked to do problems 2, 3, 5, 8, 11, 12, 15, 17, 18, and 24. For these, you are to put each of the following hypothetical syllogisms into standard form, identify any implicit premise or conclusion, identify what type of hypothetical syllogism it is, and determine whether the syllogism is valid or invalid. Beginning with problem 2. If children are deprived of affection as infants, they will learn not to expect it. And if they learn not to expect it, they won't seek it out later in life. So if children are deprived of affection early in life, they won't look for it later on. And to put this in a standard form is just going to be as follows. It kind of already was in standard form. The only thing I added to it is I added the word then here, and I added the word then here, and I should have added it here, but it's really honestly not a huge issue. But this is the argument in standard form, and this is a pure hypothetical syllogism. The argument here, everything in it is of the form if-then. The conclusion, all the premises are if-then. The conclusion is if-then. So it would be a pure hypothetical syllogism. And this argument is valid. If you were to try to figure out the symbolic form of this, we could come up here and we could put parentheses around children are deprived of affection as infants, and we could say that this is P, and then we can come over here, then they will learn not to expect it, and we could say that is Q if we wanted to. If they learn not to expect it, well, that's just Q again. They won't seek it out later in life. Well, we need a new letter here, so we could use S, and then we could use P right here. If children are deprived of affection, they won't seek it. Well, I was going with Q there, but that's S. So the form of this is if P then Q, if Q then S, therefore if P then S. And that might seem really confusing with the P's and the Q's, but I mean, maybe something easier is like if A then B, if B then C, therefore if A then C. So it's a valid syllogism. Hopefully you can see the form of it, and you can see that it is indeed valid. Okay, there we go. Number 3, I don't think you really want to marry him. If you did, you wouldn't be running around with other men the way you have been. Oh, dang, calling her out. Anyway, so let's look at what this argument is saying. I don't think you really want to marry him. If you did, you wouldn't be running around with other men the way you have. You see here in this argument, we're actually missing something. We have an implied premise in it. But the main premise, the hypothetical premise is if you wanted to marry him, you wouldn't be running around with other men the way you have. And then it concludes, so therefore I don't think you really want to marry him. But we have an implied premise, which is implying, hey, you've been running around with other men. So here's the argument. If you really wanted to marry him, you wouldn't be running around with other men the way you have. You have been running around with men. Therefore, you do not want to marry him. And this argument here, it is an example of modus tollens, and therefore it is valid. Now you might be, well, why is it an example of modus tollens? Well, let's think about this, and we could put parentheses around our antecedent, which is you really want to marry him, and then we have our consequent here, you wouldn't be running around with other men. Now notice we have that negative there. So this is going to be not Q, right? And then and what is Q referring to? Well, if you wouldn't be running around with other men is not Q, then Q is just you have been running around with other men. So here we have Q. And then we have down here, you do not want to marry him. And right here, you want to marry him. So this down here is not P. So you can see the form of this argument is if P, then not Q. Q, therefore not P. And as I've said before, Q is equal to not Q. The consequent here in the hypothetical proposition, the consequent is not Q. And to deny not Q is just to affirm Q. Because basically what Q is equal to is not Q. So if you recall, modus tollens is if P then Q, not Q then not P. But in this case, it's just a form of modus tollens. The only thing here is instead of having just Q as our consequent, we have not Q as our consequent. If P, then not Q. Well, Q actually is true. So therefore, P is false. Hopefully that makes some sense. I know it gets a little confusing when I'm speaking that abstractly, but if P, then not Q, Q, therefore not P. This is, in fact, an instance of modus tollens, and for that reason, it is valid. Number 5. I knew I would be late if I didn't hurry, but I did hurry, so I wasn't late. So I knew I would be I knew I would be late if I didn't hurry, but I did hurry, so I wasn't late. And I accidentally clicked ahead and already have this right here. But you notice that we look up here, we're trying to figure out what the hypothetical proposition is. We have something of the form up here where we have the P if Q. So we know that this part right here is going to be our antecedent. If I did not hurry, I would be late. I hurried, therefore I wasn't late. Now notice what's going on here. I didn't hurry. This is going to be basically not P. And this right here, I would be late. That is the world's worst P. I would be late. This is going to be Q. I hurried. Well, that's going to be P. And this is going to be not Q. Now notice what the form of this argument is. It's saying if not P, then Q. P, therefore Q. And this is what we call denying the antecedent. And if you recall, this is an invalid way of reasoning. You can't deny the antecedent and establish that the consequent is true. To what we would have to put right here, because keep in mind, the antecedent in this proposition is actually not P. The antecedent in this hypothetical proposition for premise number 1, this right here, the antecedent is not P. The antecedent is not just P. The antecedent is not P. So if we say P, then we're basically saying not P is false. It's just, this might be confusing, I know with all the nots, but if someone says, such and such didn't happen, and you said, no, it actually did, you're saying that, whatever they're denying is actually false. If you're like, no, he didn't, if someone says, no, he didn't lie to you, it's like, yes, he did lie to me. You're saying, not lying is false, which is just to say he did lie. So this is an instance of denying the antecedent, also invalid. Number 8. Jan made it to her appointment if the train was running on time. The train was running on time, so Jan made it to her appointment. Now if we look at this, the first proposition that's stated here, this is of the form P if Q, where we're going to just say that this is, one proposition here, and then we have, and that's our P, and then this one right here, we could at least temporarily say Q. And anytime you have P if Q, you know that you rewrite it to say if Q then P. And so the argument is going to be of the following form. If the train was running on time, then Jan made it to her appointment. The train was running on time, so Jan made it to her appointment. And hopefully you can see that this is just a simple case of modus ponens. What we have right here, if we look in this argument, we have this, which is our antecedent. The train was running on time. And then that is going to be our premise right here. Then we have, then Jan made it to her appointment, which is the consequent, which is what we have right here. So this argument is of the form if P then Q, P therefore Q, modus ponens, so it's valid. If I wait until Wednesday to take my suit to the cleaners, it will not be ready until Saturday. If so, I will not be able to wear it to the wedding on Thursday. So if I wait until Wednesday to take the suit to the cleaners, I will not be able to wear it to the wedding. And this is pretty much already in standard form. We just need to fill in a few little clauses here. But here's the argument. If I wait until Wednesday to take my suit to the cleaners, then it will not be ready until Saturday. Then we had to just fill in the antecedent of premise number 2. But if it is not ready until Saturday, then I will not be able to wear it to the wedding on Thursday. That's true. So if I wait until Wednesday to take it to the cleaners, I will not be able to wear it to the wedding. And this is an instance of a pure hypothetical syllogism. Both the premises are have hypothetical, or I should say are hypothetical propositions, and the conclusion is itself a hypothetical proposition. And this argument is valid. Number 12, Frank must be jealous of Cindy. He was following her around yesterday with a sour expression, which is exactly what he would do if he were jealous. So this one's actually a little tricky here, I thought, because if you actually look at the way it's worded, it can be, it's a little misleading in a certain way. But you need to look at this last clause right here to figure out what the key hypothetical proposition is here. But it says, which is exactly what he would do, which is when it's like, what is it he would do? Well, follow her around. So when it says he would do right here, when it's referring to that, it's like Frank would follow Cindy around with a sour expression if he were jealous. So whenever you have something like that, Frank would follow her around if he were jealous, then you know that we have a statement of the form P if Q. And whenever you have P if Q, you always rewrite it to say if Q then P. So the argument is going to be like this. If Frank was jealous, or Frank were jealous, then he would follow Cindy around with a sour expression. Frank was following Cindy around with a sour expression, therefore Frank must be jealous. And this argument is actually, it's invalid. It's an instance of affirming the consequent. And you can look right here, and you can see, here's our antecedent, and then here is our consequent. And let's just say we use P to represent Frank was jealous. Well, that's down here in the conclusion. And we use Q to represent he would follow her around. Well, then look, we see Q appear again right here. This argument is of the form if P then Q, Q therefore P. Now the reason I say it's a little tricky, because when you read this argument as it's presented in ordinary English, it actually sounds like it's a valid argument. But technically speaking, it's not. Now we could make it valid, and we could say, well look, the person was speaking loosely, and this actually I think would be a more charitable thing to do, which is just to say, if he follows her around with a sour expression, then Frank is jealous, right? If you were to rewrite this first proposition and you reverse the order of P and Q, then the argument would be valid. But technically, as it's stated, it's an invalid argument. Now, I think in the spirit of charity, we should do that, but if we're just being nitpicky logicians, well, your argument's invalid. All right, number 15. Unless we reduce the interest rate by 2%, it doesn't make sense to refinance the mortgage. And there is no way we're going to get a rate that is lower by that much. So here is a tricky one, because we have one of these what was going on there? We have one of these non-standard terms for hypothetical propositions. So whenever we have something that says unless, we know that what comes after the unless, so if you have unless and then some proposition, that this is going to be your antecedent, and it's not only going to be your antecedent, but we're going to have to say not whatever this proposition is. So it's going to be if not this, then whatever comes later, or whatever comes in the other part of the sentence. So unless we reduce the interest rate by 2%, it doesn't make sense to refinance the mortgage. What are you saying? Well, basically saying if we don't reduce the interest rate by 2%, then it doesn't make sense to refinance the mortgage. So here's how the argument would go. If we don't reduce the interest rate by 2%, then it doesn't make sense to refinance the mortgage. We do not reduce the interest rate, or you might say we can't reduce the interest rate by 2%, therefore it doesn't make sense to refinance the mortgage. And this is an instance, believe it or not, of modus ponens. It's a valid argument. Now you might be thinking, wait, how is this an instance of modus ponens because we're using these nots? Well, again, you have to look at what the antecedent is. The antecedent is we don't reduce the interest rate, and this right here is not P. Then it doesn't make sense to refinance the mortgage. We could say this is not Q, and then right here is going to be not P, and then this is going to be not, oh goodness, Q. All right, and again, the antecedent is not P. The consequent is not Q. So we are, whenever you have an instance of modus ponens, what you're doing is you're affirming the antecedent, which is perfectly okay to do. And you are saying that this is true. You're saying if not P, then not Q. You're saying, well, not P is true, therefore not Q must be true. So we are, in fact, affirming the antecedent. You have to keep in mind the antecedent is basically everything that comes between the if and the then, no matter what it is. If in between the if and the then I'd said not P or not Q and not J or whatever, right? Whatever I'd said there, I don't know. I could have this long, collection of connectives with various propositions, but as long as it comes between the if and the then, it's the antecedent. The same thing here for the consequence. As long as consequent, not consequence. Sorry, that was a slight slip of the tongue. But as long as it comes after the then it's going to be the consequent. And to affirm the antecedent, which is perfectly fine, if you have to state that whole entire thing in between the if and the then. And as long as you're affirming that entire proposition, no matter how compounded that proposition is, then it is an instance of affirming the antecedent. So we have a modus ponens at work here. Number 17, anarchy would be a fine and beautiful system for society to adopt if men were angels. Alas, they are not. So this one is interesting because we have an implied conclusion. You notice here that we don't actually ever see the conclusion stated. So part of the direction said you might have to supply any implicit conclusion, and lo and behold, here you go. So what is the key hypothetical proposition? Well, it is going to be this first one right here. If men were angels, then anarchy would be a fine and beautiful system. Men are not angels. Therefore, anarchy is not a fine and beautiful system for society to adopt. Now, look at what this argument is doing here. It seems like it's a perfectly reasonable argument, right? If men were angels, if our P, then anarchy would be fine and beautiful, Q, not P. Therefore, not Q. And what are we doing here? The antecedent in this case is P, and we are denying the antecedent, which hopefully you remember from last lecture. That's an invalid argument. And this is kind of interesting because actually here this argument, this is actually the only case I've ever heard where someone made it about anarchy, but I've heard people say socialism would be a great theory if everybody were angels. Actually, I hear it about socialism, believe it or not. Socialism would be great if everybody were angels. I've heard it about pacifism. Pacifism would be great if everybody followed it, but everybody doesn't, so it's not great. But notice that's an invalid argument. Actually, I think I put that on your first exam. I can't recall. But that's an invalid argument because it doesn't have the correct form. And it's misleading because the way that probably a lot of people are thinking about it is if anarchy is fine and beautiful, then men are angels. Men are not angels, therefore anarchy is not fine and beautiful. If for instance you were in this case to reverse the P and Q, reverse the antecedent and consequent, it would work, but that's not the way the argument is stated, and it's actually invalid. It's an invalid argument. Number 18. If someone had been snooping around here last night, there would be footprints, right? Well, there are. So someone must have been, or someone was snooping around here last night. So here we have our argument, and here's it in standard form. If someone had been snooping around here, there would be footprints. There are footprints, therefore someone was snooping around. And look at this argument right here. We can look at its form. It's if P, we have our P right here, then Q. Well, look, Q, man, that's a really poorly written. Q is equal to there will be footprints. Well, there are footprints, so we have Q right here. Someone was snooping around last night. That's our P. So here's our argument. If P, then Q, Q, therefore P. And this is an instance of affirming the consequent, which is not a valid way of reasoning. You can't say if A occurs, then B occurred. Well, B occurred, so A must have. That's not a sound way of reasoning at all. I think it's pretty evident here. What what is going on here is footprints. This is the problem with this argument. Having footprints around, as it stated, is a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition for someone to have been snooping. I mean, maybe someone just walked through your backyard by accident. You know, maybe someone got lost, but it doesn't mean they were snooping necessarily, right? So just having or maybe the footprints were left there a while ago, or maybe a serviceman had come by to check the water meter. Who knows why the footprints are there? But the point here is having footprints in your backyard is a necessary condition. If someone's snooping, there have to be footprints, but just because there are footprints doesn't mean that someone was snooping. So this is an invalid argument. Again, it's an instance of affirming the consequent. Number 24. You won't be able to master logic unless you are serious about it. But if you have read this far, you must be serious. So if you have read this far, you will be able to master logic. To put this in a standard form, we have to begin with the first sentence, which the first sentence uses one of these non-standard terms, unless, to indicate a hypothetical relationship. If you say you won't be able to master logic unless you are serious about it, what you're basically saying is if you are not serious about logic, then you won't be able to master it. I think the rest of the argument is pretty straightforward, but here's how it goes. If you are not serious about logic, then you won't be able to master it. If you have read this far, you must be serious. Therefore, if you have read this far, you will be able to master logic. And this argument is a pure hypothetical syllogism, and it is invalid. In fact, if you just read through it and think about the logic of it, it's pretty all over the place. This argument doesn't work at all. So I hope that these exercises are coming to you and they're not overly complicated. I know that sometimes when you're dealing with the P's and the Q's, it can be a little tricky at times. But if you're starting to get the hang of this and you're feeling a little more comfortable with it, then you're probably doing okay. If you're having questions about this, please, like always, feel free to email me and we can work through them together.